The autumn wind, a chill lament sweeping down from the Minakami peaks, carried the scent of decaying leaves and the distant, mournful cry of a solitary crane. Takeda Kenjiro, a name he now wore like a shroud, walked the narrow, overgrown path, his shadow long and gone in the waning afternoon light. Once he had been a samurai, his daisho a symbol of fealty to Lord Matsuyama, his life ordered by the precise tenets of Bushido. Now Lord Matsuyama was ashes, his domain scattered, and Kenjiro was but a Ronin, a waveman adrift on the bitter sea of a broken world. His worn straw sandals whispered against the fallen maple leaves, each step a metronome counting out the rhythm of his grief, a sorrow so profound it had become the very marrow of his bones. He carried his swords not with pride, but with the weary resignation of a craftsman whose tools had outlived their purpose, or perhaps had been instruments in a tragedy he could neither forgive nor forget. His heart was a stone garden, meticulously raked but barren, where the memory of his wife, Haney, and their two young daughters, Akiko and Kimi, bloomed like ghostly, pain-filled chrysanthemums. They had been taken by the sweating sickness that had swept through their village while he was away, fighting his lord's feudal battles, a plague that respected neither rank nor innocence. He had returned to silence, to cold hearths, to the devastating emptiness that had since become his constant companion. This wandering was his penance, his search not for redemption which he felt beyond his grasp, but for a quiet place to lay down his burden, a final stillness to match the desolation within. The landscape mirrored his soul, skeletal trees clawing at a leaden sky, the earth preparing for the harsh sleep of winter. His senses, honed by years of vigilance, were a constant, low thrum, registering the snap of a distant twig, the rustle of unseen creatures, the subtle shifts in the wind. It was this ingrained alertness that made him pause, not a sound of overt danger, but a dissonance in the forest's mournful song, a faint, almost inaudible whimper, thin and reedy like the cry of a wounded kit. He tilted his head, his face, etched with lines of hardship and sorrow, impassive. His instinct was to ignore it, to continue on his solitary path, for involvement meant pain, and he had supped full of that. Yet, the sound, so fragile, so steeped in despair, snagged at a deeply buried chord within him, a vestige of the protector he once had been. He moved towards it, his passage through the dense undergrowth as silent as a falling snowflake, his hand resting, not on his katana but on the rough hilt of his walking staff, a symbol of his reduced state. The whimpering grew slightly louder, punctuated by a soft, rhythmic rustling. Then he saw them. Against the broad, dark trunk of an ancient gnarled oak, its branches bare and supplicating to the gray sky, two small figures were bound. Girls. Twins, by the look of their identical, dirt-streaked faces and tangled black hair. They couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 winters old, their tiny bodies clad in thin, ragged kimonos, their limbs secured to the unforgiving bark with coarse hemp rope that cut cruelly into their tender flesh. Their eyes, huge and dark in their small, pale faces, were wide with a terror so profound it had frozen their cries into those soft, hopeless whimpers. One had a fresh scratch on her cheek, a crimson line against the pallor of her skin, perhaps from struggling, or from a thorny branch. The other's head lolled slightly, as if on the verge of unconsciousness. Kenjiro stopped, the sight of physical blow stealing the air from his lungs. A cold fury and emotion he had thought long dead flickered in the frozen landscape of his heart, quickly followed by a wave of nausea. This was not the work of bandits, this was a different kind of cruelty, deliberate, ritualistic, monstrous. He saw not just 2 abandoned children, but the ghosts of Akiko and Kimi, their innocent faces superimposed onto these suffering innocents. The pain was so sharp, so immediate, it was as if their loss were happening all over again. For a moment he was paralyzed, the warrior in him assessing the tactical situation, no immediate threat, only the victims, while the father in him screamed in silent agony. The wind sighed through the oak's branches, a sound like weeping. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and then another, forcing down the rage, the grief, letting the ice of his discipline settle over the storm within. He had to act. His own suffering was a private hell. This, before him, was an abomination that demanded intervention. This was not a choice, it was an imperative. His code, though tarnished and broken, still whispered of compassion, of protecting the weak, even if the world had shown him little of either. Kenjiro approached the ancient oak with the slow, measured steps of a man entering a defiled shrine. The twin girls flinched violently as his shadow fell over them, their whimpers ceasing, replaced by a held-breath terror that was almost more heartbreaking. One of them, the one with the scratch on her cheek, squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping to trace a clean path through the grime. The other, whose head had been lolling, seemed to rally a fraction. Her gaze fixed on him with the desperate intensity of a trapped animal. He could smell the fear coming off them. A sharp, acrid scent that mingled with the damp earth and decaying leaves. He knelt, making himself smaller, less threatening, his movements economical and deliberate. "O Serenade," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse, the words meaning, "Do not be afraid," though he knew they were an inadequate balm for such profound terror. He reached for the hilt of his wakizashi, and the girl with open eyes gasped, a tiny, choked sound, her body tensing as if expecting a blow. Kenjiro paused, then slowly drew the short sword, holding it so they could see the blade was not aimed at them, but at the ropes. He worked with meticulous care, his callous fingers surprisingly gentle as he maneuvered the razor-sharp edge between their raw skin and the biting hem. The ropes were cruelly tight, deeply embedded, and he had to cut them strand by strand, his breath hissing softly through his teeth at the sight of the bruised, chafed flesh beneath. As the first coil fell away from one girl's wrist, she slumped further against the tree as if the tension holding her upright had been severed along with the rope. He supported her with one arm while continuing to work on her siblings' bonds. The silence of the forest pressed in, broken only by the rasp of the blade against fiber and the twins' shallow, ragged breathing. When the last rope fell away, both girls were limp, their small bodies trembling uncontrollably, either from cold, shock, or a combination of both. He carefully eased them away from the rough bark, laying them gently on a patch of moss he had noticed nearby, a small oasis of green in the otherwise somber hues of the forest floor. Their kimonos were thin and offered little protection against the autumn chill, their feet were bare, blue with cold. He quickly unslung his own worn cloak, a thick, patchwork garment that had been his companion through countless cold nights, and wrapped it around them, tucking it carefully to conserve every bit of warmth. He had a small waterskin, half full, and a piece of dried fish wrapped in a cloth, meager provisions, but more than they had. He offered the waterskin first, touching it gently to the lips of the girl, who seemed more alert. She drank weakly, her eyes never leaving his face, still filled with a deep, animal mistrust. The other required more coaxing, but eventually she too took a few sips. He broke off tiny pieces of the fish, softening them with a little water, and offered them. They ate with a desperate, famished hunger that spoke of days without food. Kenjiro watched them, his face an unreadable mask, but inside, the stone garden of his heart was cracking, unfamiliar emotions seeping through like persistent weeds. The echo of his own lost daughters was deafening. Akiko had been fearless, Kimi more timid, but both had possessed that innocent, unshakable trust in him, their father, their protector. These children had known only betrayal. Who could do such a thing? Leave them to die of exposure, or to be taken by wolves? The method, tied to a tree, spoke of a public shaming or a ritualistic abandonment. His mind, trained to analyze, began to sift through possibilities. Bandits were usually more direct, their cruelty born of expediency or crude pleasure. This felt different, colder, imbued with a sense of judgment, however perverse. Superstition? Some dark village custom? He had heard tales of remote hamlets where twins were considered ill omens, harbingers of famine or disease, to be exposed or sacrificed to appease angry spirits. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold fury through him. He looked at their faces, so alike yet subtly different. One had a small mole just above her left eyebrow, the other's chin was a fraction more pointed. He found himself searching for resemblances to Akiko and Kimi, a futile exercise in self-torture, yet one he could not resist. They were so small, so utterly vulnerable. His initial urge after the immediate rescue might have been to find them a stream, ensure they had food, and then leave them near a road where they might be found by more charitable souls. His path was solitary, his grief was a jealous companion. But looking at them now, huddled together in his cloak, their small bodies still racked by occasional tremors, he knew he could not abandon them. It was not merely a matter of duty. It was something deeper, a resonance with his own shattered fatherhood. A desperate need to shield these two small flames from the darkness that had consumed his own. His journey for a quiet end was now irrevocably altered. These children were a new, unexpected weight, a responsibility he had not sought but would not shrug off. The nearest village, according to his mental map of this desolate region, was perhaps half a day's walk to the east, nestled in a narrow valley. He would take them there. He would demand answers. And if necessary, he would exact justice. The thought was a cold, hard pebble in the pit of his stomach. He rose, the decision made, the ice in his veins solidifying into a grim resolve. He would carry them if necessary. He looked up at the darkening sky. The wind had picked up, carrying the first hint of sleet. They needed shelter, and soon. He gently gathered the two small, bundled forms into his arms. They were lighter than he expected, their fragility a palpable ache against his chest. As he held them, one of them, the one with the mole, stirred and her small hand, unconsciously seeking warmth or comfort, brushed against his rough cheek. The contact was like a spark on tinder, igniting a flicker of warmth in the frozen chambers of his heart, a warmth so unexpected, so unwelcome in its intensity that it almost brought him to his knees. The journey to the village was an exercise in grim endurance, each step a testament to Takeda Kenjiro's rekindled, albeit reluctant, purpose. The twin girls, whom he carried alternately or sometimes together, a fragile burden against his broad chest, remained mostly silent, their earlier whimpers subdued into a watchful, exhausted stillness. He had named them in his mind, provisionally, for his own sanity. Hana, the one with the small mole above her eyebrow who seemed to possess a flicker more resilience, her dark eyes occasionally meeting his with a fearful curiosity, and Yuki, the more fragile one whose pallor mirrored the first snows of winter and whose gaze often drifted, lost in some inner landscape of trauma. He walked with the relentless, ground-covering pace of a man accustomed to hardship, his senses stretched taut, scanning the dense, unwelcoming forest for any sign of further threat, be it from beast or man. The wind, sharp as a freshly honed blade, tore at his thin clothing and the intermittent sleet stung his exposed face, but he barely registered the discomfort, his focus entirely on the precious, shivering lives he carried. His own grief, a constant companion for so many seasons, had not lessened, but it had shifted, its sharp edges momentarily blunted by the immediacy of this new, demanding sorrow. The ghosts of Akiko and Kimi walked beside him, their remembered laughter a mournful counterpoint to the twins' fragile silence. He imagined his wife Haney's gentle disapproval of his solitary despair, her quiet strength that had always been his anchor. Now, these rescued girls, Hana and Yuki, were an unexpected tether to the world of the living, a world he had been steadily retreating from. His thoughts churned, replaying the scene at the oak tree, the cruel ropes, the abject terror in their eyes. Who were they? Why had they been singled out for such a barbaric fate? The lack of any nearby struggle, the almost ritualistic nature of their binding, pointed away from a random act of violence by passing brigands. This had the hallmarks of a community's decision, a village purging itself of something it feared or despised. The closer they drew to the outskirts of what he presumed was the nearest settlement, marked by the thinning of the ancient forest and the appearance of roughly cleared land, fallow and frost-kissed, the heavier the sense of foreboding grew within him. He saw no welcoming smoke from hearth fires, heard no distant sounds of children playing or dogs barking, only an unnatural stillness that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. He paused at the edge of a barren rice paddy, its stubbled earth cracked and desolate, to adjust the girls in his arms. Hana stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, and for the first time there was something other than pure terror in her gaze, a flicker of questioning, perhaps even a nascent trust. He offered her a faint, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture he hoped conveyed reassurance, though his own heart was a knot of apprehension. Yuki remained limply asleep, or perhaps unconscious, her breathing shallow. He pressed on, his jaw set. The first hovels of the village came into view, dilapidated structures of mud and thatch, huddled together as if for meager comfort against the encroaching wilderness and the biting wind. A pall of silence hung over the place, broken only by the creak of a weathered prayer while spinning fitfully in the breeze outside a small, neglected shrine. As he stepped into the narrow, muddy track that served as the village's main thoroughfare, figures began to emerge from the gloomy interiors of the huts. Men and women, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, their clothing as patched and worn as his own. They stared, first at him, the armed stranger, then at the bundled forms in his arms. A collective gasp, a ripple of what looked like fear, or perhaps guilt, passed through them. Whispers erupted, sibilant and urgent, like dry leaves skittering across frozen ground. No one approached. No one offered welcome or inquiry. They merely stood, a silent, accusing, or accused audience. Kenjiro stopped in the center of what passed for a village square, a small, muddy clearing where a well with a broken windlass stood. He gently lowered the girls to sit on a rough-hewn log, keeping his cloak wrapped tightly around them, shielding them as much from the villagers' hostile stares as from the cold. He straightened, his hand resting near the hilt of his katana, not as a threat, but as a reminder of who he was, a warrior even in disgrace. His gaze, cold and unwavering, swept across the assembled villagers. "Kono Keotachi wa derda?" he demanded, his voice low but carrying an authority that cut through their fearful murmurs. "Who are these children? Neizano Mori and I Shiburit Ida? Why were they bound in that forest?" Silence. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away from his, fixing on the ground, on the distant, unforgiving mountains anywhere but at him or the two small figures at his feet. An old man, his face a roadmap of hardship, his back bent with age and toil, shuffled forward, leaning heavily on a gnarled staff. He appeared to be the village elder. His eyes, though clouded with cataracts, held a spark of weary resignation. "Kararewa, Imawashi Mano Deru," the elder croaked, his voice thin and reedy. "They are cursed things." Cursed. Kenjiro's blood ran cold. So his suspicions had been correct. This was not a random act, but a deliberate, superstitious purge. "Naroi." Kenjiro's voice was dangerously soft. "A curse?" Futego, another villager, a woman with a pinched, bitter face, spat out the word as if it were poison. "Twins. Our crops have failed for 2 seasons," the elder explained, his voice heavy with a desperate fatalism. "The river spirits are angry. The oracle at the mountain shrine declared that the birth of twins in our midst has brought this misfortune. They had to be offered back to the forest to appease the spirits, offered back. A euphemism for murder by exposure." Kenjiro looked at the twin girls, Hana now clutching Yuki, her small face set in a look of fierce, terrified protection that tore at his soul. He saw the faces of Akiko and Kimi, innocent, trusting, and a rage so profound, so glacial, rose within him that it almost choked him. He had faced down armies, endured loss that would have broken lesser men, but this calculated cruelty against the utterly defenseless, cloaked in the sanctimony of superstition, was an obscenity that transcended anything he had ever witnessed. He fought to control the tremor in his hands, the burning in his chest. His gaze swept over the villagers again, seeing not just fear now, but a dull, hardened cruelty born of desperation and ignorance. They had condemned these children to a horrific death, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of a craven fear that had extinguished their humanity. The silence that descended upon the village square was heavier than the leaden sky, charged with the unspoken horrors of the elder's confession. Takeda Kenjiro stood like a figure carved from ancient granite, the wind tugging at his frayed kajuri, his face an unreadable mask that barely contained the maelstrom within. The villagers watched him, their earlier fear now tinged with a desperate anticipation of judgment. They expected righteous fury, the flash of steel, a Ronin's bloody retribution for their heinous act. Perhaps some even craved it, a swift punishment to expiate the guilt that gnawed at their souls, a guilt now laid bare by this grim stranger. But Kenjiro did not draw his sword. His hand, which had rested near its hilt, fell slowly to his side. The cold rage still simmered within him, a glacial fire, but it was overlaid with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight upon his shoulders. To slaughter these wretched, fear-driven people would achieve nothing. It would only perpetuate the cycle of violence and despair that had plagued his own life for so long. It would not bring back Akiko and Kimi. It would not undo the terror these twin girls, Hana and Yuki, had endured. Instead, he moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness. He knelt beside the 2 small, shivering forms, his back to the silent, watching villagers. He gently unwrapped his cloak from around them, ignoring the biting wind that now seemed to penetrate his own thin garments to the bone. He took his waterskin and a relatively clean strip of cloth he tore from the lining of his gi and began to carefully, tenderly, wash the grime from their faces, their small hands, the raw, chafed skin of their wrists and ankles where the ropes had bitten deep. His touch was as gentle as a summer breeze, his movements precise, almost reverent. Hana watched him, her dark eyes wide, unblinking, a flicker of confusion warring with the ingrained terror. Yuki remained listless, her breathing shallow, but she did not resist his ministrations. The villagers murmured amongst themselves, a low, uneasy rustling. This was not the judgment they had expected. This quiet act of tenderness, performed with such solemn dignity in the face of their collective cruelty, was more unsettling than any outburst of rage. When he had cleaned them as best he could, Kenjiro reached into the small pouch at his belt where he kept his meager possessions. He produced a small, intricately carved wooden comb, Haney's comb, one of the few precious mementos he carried from his past life. His fingers, calloused and scarred from years of wielding a sword, trembled almost imperceptibly as he began to gently smooth the tangled knots from Hana's dark hair. He worked patiently, his gaze distant as if seeing not the terrified child before him, but other small heads, other dark tresses he had once lovingly caressed. When he finished with Hana, he did the same for Yuki, whose hair was matted with dirt and bits of leaf. The act was intensely personal, almost sacred, a silent communion with his own lost fatherhood. Then he spoke, his voice no longer the sharp demand of a warrior, but low, resonant, heavy with a grief that seemed to fill the cold air of the square, a grief that was ancient and universal. "Watashi and I amo musume jiita," he began, his gaze fixed on the distant, snow-capped peaks, as if addressing the spirits of the mountains themselves, or perhaps the ghosts of his own daughters. "I too had daughters." A hush fell over the villagers. They strained to hear his words, their faces etched with a dawning apprehension. "Two of them," he continued, his voice thick with unshed tears he refused to let fall. "Their names were Akiko and Kimi. They were the light of my life, the laughter in my house, the warmth against the winter's chill." He paused, the silence broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind. "They were taken from me. Not by angry spirits, not by a curse, but by a fever that swept through our village like a fire through dry grass. I was away fighting a war for a lord who is now dust. I returned to silence, to emptiness." His gaze slowly came back to the villagers, and for the first time they saw not a fearsome Ronin, but a man stripped bare, his soul exposed, his sorrow a raw, gaping wound. "You speak of curses," he said, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. "You speak of appeasing spirits by sacrificing the innocent." He gestured towards Hana and Yuki, who now huddled close to him as if sensing a shield in his sorrow. "Look at them. Are these not flesh and blood? Do they not feel pain, hunger, fear, as your own children do? Did you look into their eyes before you condemn them? Did you see anything there but the terror you yourselves instilled?" He rose slowly to his full height, a figure of immense, sorrowful dignity. He did not need to raise his voice. His quiet words carried the weight of irrefutable truth, the authority of profound suffering. "You sought to cast out a shadow from your village," he said, his voice now imbued with a steely resolve. "But in doing so, you have embraced a deeper darkness. You have sacrificed your own humanity on the altar of fear." He then did something that stunned them into absolute silence. He carefully lifted Hana into his arms, then Yuki. He held them not as burdens, but as precious, irreplaceable treasures. "These children are not a curse," he declared, his voice ringing with a conviction that brooked no argument. "They are a gift, a chance, a reminder of what it means to be human, to feel compassion, to protect the vulnerable." He took a step towards the terrified elder. "I will not spill your blood. Your fear has made you less than men, and my blade is for warriors, not for cowards who prey on infants. But your atonement begins now." He looked around at the silent, shamefaced villagers. "These children will live. They will live here, in this village. You will care for them. You will feed them, clothe them, protect them. You will learn from them what you have forgotten, how to love, how to hope." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And I," he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying immense power, "I will stay. I will stay until I see humanity rekindled in your eyes. I will stay to ensure these lights are not extinguished by your darkness again. This is my judgment." He then turned his back on them and walked towards the most dilapidated, abandoned hut at the edge of the square, the two small girls held securely in his arms, his sorrowful, righteous presence a far greater condemnation than any sword stroke could ever have been. The weight of Takeda Kenjiro's judgment settled upon the village like the deep stillness after a storm, heavy and profound. There was no outcry, no protest, only a stunned, collective silence as the villagers watched the lone Ronin carry the twin girls into the derelict hut. His words, raw with his own grief yet unyielding in their moral force, had stripped away their justifications, leaving them exposed and ashamed before the stark reality of their actions. The image of him, a hardened warrior, tenderly combing the children's hair with his wife's memento, then speaking of his own lost daughters, had shattered their hardened shells of fear and superstition. He had not met their barbarity with reciprocal violence, but with a sorrowful compassion that was infinitely more devastating. As dusk began to settle, casting long, mournful shadows across the desolate square, the first sound broke the silence. It was a woman, the one who had earlier spat out the word twins like a curse. She sank to her knees in the cold mud, her face crumpling, and a low, choked sob escaped her lips. It was as if a dam had broken. Another villager, a stout man who had stood defiantly at the front of the crowd, covered his face with his rough hands, his shoulders shaking. Soon, the square was filled with the sound of weeping, not the performative wails of feigned remorse, but deep, shuddering sobs of genuine grief, shame, and a dawning, agonizing empathy. They wept for the terror they had inflicted upon Hana and Yuki. They wept for their own lost humanity, for the fear that had twisted their hearts into such cruel shapes. And perhaps they wept for the sorrow of the Ronin himself, whose personal tragedy had become a mirror reflecting their own profound failings. Kenjiro, inside the small, cold hut, heard their cries. He had managed to find a few discarded scraps of straw to make a pallet for the girls and had coaxed a tiny, smoky fire from damp twigs in the crumbling hearth. Hana and Yuki, exhausted beyond measure, had finally succumbed to a fitful sleep, huddled together under his cloak, their small faces still pale but no longer contorted by immediate terror. He sat by the meager fire, his back against the damp earthen wall, listening to the village's collective lament. There was no triumph in him, no satisfaction, only a bone-deep weariness and the aching throb of his old, familiar grief, now strangely mingled with a fragile, nascent sense of purpose. He had not sought this role, this burden, but it had found him. And in the weeping of the village, he heard not just their remorse, but perhaps the first faint stirring of something new, a possibility for healing, for atonement. The days that followed were a slow, arduous unfolding. Kenjiro did not preach or threaten. He simply was. His presence, quiet and constant, was a silent rebuke and a steadying anchor. He spent his time tending to Hana and Yuki, coaxing them to eat the meager broth he prepared, patiently encouraging them to speak, though they remained mostly mute, their trauma a heavy cloak. He began to repair the dilapidated hut, his movements economical and skilled, patching the holes in the roof with scavenged thatch, reinforcing the crumbling walls with mud and straw. He did not ask for help, but soon, tentatively, it began to arrive. The first was the old elder, who appeared one morning with a small bundle of dried herbs and a cracked wooden bowl filled with millet. He said nothing, merely placed the offerings at the threshold of the hut and shuffled away. Then, the woman who had wept first brought a worn but clean blanket. Others followed, leaving small gifts of food, firewood, a mended piece of clothing. They avoided his gaze, their faces still etched with shame, but their actions spoke of a hesitant, burgeoning desire to make amends. Kenjiro accepted their offerings with a quiet nod, his demeanor unchanging. He began to speak to the children more, telling them simple stories he remembered from his own childhood, tales of brave animals and mischievous spirits of the forest, trying to coax a spark of light back into their haunted eyes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Hana and Yuki began to respond. Hana was the first to offer a fleeting, shy smile. Yuki, one afternoon, while Kenjiro was whittling a small wooden bird for them, reached out a tiny hand and touched his rough fingers. It was a small gesture, yet it resonated through him with the force of a temple gong. He taught the villagers by example. When a dispute arose over the sharing of scarce water, he intervened not with force, but with quiet reason, reminding them of the interdependence that was their only hope for survival. He showed them how to set more effective snares, how to identify edible roots they had overlooked, his knowledge of the wilderness proving invaluable. He never spoke of Bushido, yet his every action was a lesson in its truest tenets: righteousness, courage, compassion, sincerity. The village began to change. The oppressive silence was gradually replaced by the sounds of hesitant activity, the low murmur of voices, the rhythmic thud of a repaired loom. The weeping had ceased, but a new solemnity had taken its place, a shared understanding of their near-fatal transgression and the unexpected path to redemption offered by the grieving Ronin. The children, Hana and Yuki, became the unspoken heart of this transformation. Villagers who had once averted their eyes in fear or revulsion now offered them shy smiles, a piece of fruit, a roughly carved toy. They were no longer a curse, but a symbol of the village's fragile hope, a living testament to their capacity for change. Kenjiro watched all this, his stoic facade rarely cracking, but within him something was slowly mending. The stone garden of his heart began to show tiny, tender shoots of green. His grief for Akiko and Kimi remained, a scar that would never fully fade, but it was no longer a consuming desolation. It had found a purpose, a meaning, in the saving of these other two lives. He knew he would not stay forever. His path was still that of a wanderer. But his wandering would no longer be a flight from sorrow, but a journey towards a quiet, earned peace. The entire village had wept, and in those tears they had begun to wash away their sins, guided by a grieving Ronin who had shown them that even in the deepest darkness, the light of compassion could be rekindled, and that true honor lay not in codes or swords, but in the unwavering courage to protect the innocent and heal the broken. The seasons turned, the harsh winds of winter yielding to the tentative warmth of spring, and then the full-throated green of summer. Takeda Kenjiro remained in the small village, a silent, watchful presence, as potent in his stillness as he had once been in battle. The hut he had repaired for himself and the twin girls became a quiet focal point, not of authority, but of a certain moral gravity. Hana and Yuki, under his steadfast, gentle care and the slowly awakening compassion of the village, began to blossom. Their silences became less frequent, replaced by whispered conversations with each other, then tentative words spoken to Kenjiro, and eventually even shy interactions with the village children who, no longer fed tales of curses, approached them with curiosity and then acceptance. Hana, with her innate resilience, became fiercely protective of Yuki, yet her eyes, when they rested on Kenjiro, held a deep, unwavering trust that was both a balm and a heavy responsibility to him. Yuki, more fragile, still bore the deeper scars of their ordeal, often waking from nightmares, but she found solace in Kenjiro's quiet presence, in the rhythm of his breathing as he sat watch by their sleeping pallet, or in the rough, comforting texture of his calloused hand when he would gently stroke her hair. Kenjiro taught them not the way of the sword, but the language of the forest, the names of the wildflowers that now carpeted the meadows, the calls of the birds that nested in the eaves of their hut. He showed them how to find beauty in small things, resilience in the face of hardship, a lesson he himself was slowly relearning. The village, too, continued its transformation. The fear that had once choked their spirits had loosened its grip, replaced by a shared, quiet determination to rebuild. Not just their homes and their fields, but their community, their souls. The harvest that summer, nurtured by timely rains and a newfound diligence, was surprisingly bountiful. There were no pronouncements of angry spirits appeased, only a humble gratitude and a collective understanding that their fortune had turned not because of a sacrifice offered, but because of a sacrifice averted, and because of the hard lessons learned from a grieving stranger. Kenjiro never raised his voice, never issued commands. Yet, his influence was profound. He mediated disputes with a calm, impartial wisdom. He organized watches when rumors of bandits in the surrounding hills reached them, his old warrior instincts providing a sense of security the village had long lacked. He did not seek leadership, but it was thrust upon him by a people who had come to respect not his swords but the unwavering moral compass that guided him. His own grief, the sharp, tearing pain of Akiko and Kimi's loss, had not vanished. It remained a part of him like the worn hilt of his katana, a familiar, somber weight. But it no longer consumed him. In the laughter of Hana and Yuki, in their small hands trustingly placed in his, he found echoes of what he had lost, not as a source of fresh pain, but as a poignant reminder of the preciousness of life, a preciousness he was now privileged to protect. He found a measure of transcendent peace, not in forgetting, but in transforming his sorrow into a quiet strength, a compassionate resolve. One crisp autumn morning, a year after his arrival, Kenjiro knew it was time to leave. The village was healing. The fields were golden with ripening rice. Hana and Yuki were safe, loved, their futures no longer a terrifying uncertainty but a path unfolding within a community that had learned to cherish them. The elder, his gaze now clear and filled with a respectful wisdom, had formally adopted them as his own grandchildren, a public act of atonement and affection that resonated through every household. Kenjiro packed his meager belongings, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as always. He said his farewells to no one but the girls. He knelt before them and for the first time allowed a rare, gentle smile to touch his lips. "Shisai Sakura no Hana," he said softly, "little cherry blossoms," a term of endearment he had once used for his own daughters. Be strong. Be kind. Remember the lessons of the forest and the resilience of your own hearts. Hana, now a sturdy girl with bright, intelligent eyes, threw her arms around his neck, a gesture of uninhibited affection that made his heart ache with a sweet sorrow. Yuki, her shyness still present but no longer crippling, pressed a small, carefully woven circlet of wildflowers into his hand. "For your journey, Takeda Ajizan," she whispered, using the affectionate term for uncle. He held the fragile wreath as if it were the most precious treasure, then rose. He walked out of the village without looking back, though he could feel their small eyes, and indeed the eyes of the entire village, upon him. He knew they would weep again, not with the guilt and shame of before, but with a sorrowful gratitude for the stranger who had come out of the wilderness, a grieving Ronin who had found two lost souls bound to a tree and in saving them, had inadvertently saved an entire community from itself. His act, born of his own profound loss and an unyielding sense of honor, had rippled outwards, transforming despair into hope, cruelty into compassion. The story of Takeda Kenjiro and the twin girls would become a legend in that village, whispered around hearth fires for generations to come, a reminder of a dark time but also of the extraordinary capacity for redemption. A testament to the fact that even a heart shattered by grief could become a vessel for profound healing. As Kenjiro walked his solitary path once more, the autumn wind carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke, he was no longer just a wave man, adrift and purposeless. He was a man who had faced his deepest sorrows and found not an end to them but a way to carry them with a quiet dignity, a man who had learned that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with steel but with the unwavering courage of a compassionate heart. The entire village had wept, and in their tears, Takeda Kenjiro had found a measure of his own peace, his legacy not in fallen banners or battlefield glories, but in the laughter of two rescued children and the quiet, enduring strength of a reborn community.